The night was calm, with the lake reflecting the soft glow of the moon like a silver sheet stretched across the earth. But inside my chest, there was no calm. My hands trembled as I sat down to steaming mugs of coffee on the table, my heart pounding, with the weight of the meeting about to unfold. For months, I had carried the burden of a fight I never asked for. A war ignited by a woman who thought power came from arrogance. What she didn't know was that tonight, the very cabin she had stormed into so many times to assert her control, I was not sitting alone. Tonight, the state's highest authority was listening, and that mistake would be her downfall. It had all begun 2 years earlier, when I inherited the lake cabin from my father. To me, it was more than just wood and nails. It was memory, legacy, the scent of pine, and the echo of laughter from summers past. Dad built it himself, plank by plank, when money was tight but dreams were big. After he passed, the cabin became my way of staying close to him. Every weekend, I'd drive down, fix what needed fixing, and sit on the old dock, staring at the stars, hearing his voice in the ripples of the water. It wasn't just a cabin. It was home. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They claimed it was community property. That my father's cabin standing there long before their bylaws were written was subject to their rules. They fined me for the paint color, fined me for the dock length, fined me even for the excessive smoke when I lit a fire in the fireplace. At first, I ignored them. After all, my dad used to tell me, "Don't wrestle with pigs, you both. Get dirty, and the pig likes it." But ignoring only seemed to fuel them more. That's when she arrived, their president, Karen Whitmore. Blonde bob cut, pearls always around her neck, and a voice that carried like a whip through glass. Karen didn't knock when she came to the cabin the first time. She barged in, clipboard in hand, scanning every corner like a wolf scenting prey. "This place is in violation of at least 10 codes," she'd announced without even introducing herself. I stood there, gripping the mug of coffee I had made, just seconds before, wondering who gave her the right. She smiled, sharp, smug. "We'll make this easy. You comply, or you sell. Either way, this cabin won't stay yours much longer." Those words burned me. Sell. This was my father's sweat, my family's history. Selling wasn't an option. I told her to leave, that she had no authority here. But Karen never took no as an answer. She started coming back, always unannounced, always pushing. Sometimes when I wasn't there, sometimes while I was asleep inside. More than once, I woke to find her standing on my dock, snapping photos, scribbling notes. The final straw was the day she stormed in while my little niece, Emily, was staying over. Emily was only 8, curled up on the couch with her sketchbook. When Karen busted through the door like she owned it, the fear in my niece's eyes broke something in me that day. From then on, it wasn't just about me. It was about protecting my family, protecting my father's legacy. And Karen had no idea that her greed and cruelty had planted the seeds of her own undoing. By summer's end, I had collected enough letters, fines, and harassment notices to fill a shoebox. My friends told me to fight back legally, but court cases take time and money, things Karen was counting on me not to have. But fate has its own sense of timing. At a community meeting one evening, I spoke up, my voice shaking but clear, about the way Karen abused her power. Most folks lowered their heads, afraid of her wrath. But one man at the back of the room looked up sharply. He approached me afterward, introducing himself as someone working closely with the state attorney general's office. He handed me his card. "If half of what you say is true," he told me, "then she's not just breaking your spirit, she's breaking the law." That was the spark. That card burned a hole in my pocket for weeks as I debated what to do. Finally, after Karen sent me a threat of foreclosure over a supposed illegal dock light, I called the number. Within days, I was sitting in my cabin with the Attorney General's investigator. laying out every paper, every photograph, every story of Karen's harassment. They listened, really listened, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I wasn't alone in this fight. But Karen's arrogance knew no limits. She didn't just stop at letters and fines. One crisp autumn evening, as I sat inside with the investigator, a knock never came. Instead, the door flew open, hinges cracking against the wall. Karen stormed in, heels clicking on the wood floor. Her voice shrill. "This is an unauthorized gathering. You cannot have meetings here without board approval." She didn't even realize who was sitting across from me. She didn't care. She saw me, and like always, she saw weakness. But this time, she was wrong. The investigator leaned back calmly, folding his hands, watching her with eyes that gave away nothing. I sat frozen, heart hammering, knowing what was about to unfold. Karen's tirade filled the room, her threats pouring like acid. And then the man finally spoke. Not loud, not sharp, just steady. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, pulling out a badge that caught the lamplight. "I don't believe you understand who you're dealing with." Karen's face blanched. For the first time since I'd met her, she stumbled over her words. But the damage was done. She had stormed into my cabin, trespassing, threatening, right in front of the state attorney general's own representative. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. And in that silence, I realized the fight had finally turned. For once, she was the one cornered. Karen's heels froze mid-step, like she'd just stepped onto thin ice and realized too late how deep the water below was. Her face, usually painted with that smug smirk, twisted into something else: confusion, disbelief, and just a trace of fear she couldn't quite hide. "Excuse me?" she stammered, her voice no longer slicing the room in half the way it usually did. The man across from me didn't flinch. He calmly placed the badge on the table, letting the golden seal catch the light. "You've just trespassed into private property," he said evenly, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "And you've interrupted an ongoing investigation with the state attorney general's office." He leaned back, fingers interlaced, watching her with that piercing patience only someone in authority could hold. "Would you like to try that again?" I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. For months, I had been the one trembling under her threats, the one cleaning up after her intrusions, the one explaining to my family why we had to endure her cruelty. But now, for the first time, she looked like the little girl who'd been caught red-handed, with no idea how to explain herself. Karen swallowed, her eyes darting between me and the investigator. This is highly irregular," she sputtered. "As president of the Homeowners Association, I have every right to inspect. You have no right here." The man interrupted sharply, his tone now carrying weight that filled the entire cabin. "This cabin is private property, predating your association's bylaws. Every fine, every letter, every threat you've issued has already been cataloged and submitted for review. What you've just done tonight, Mrs. Whitmore, is more than a mistake. It's a crime." Karen's pearl necklace trembled against her chest as she struggled to regain her composure. I could almost hear her brain scrambling, trying to stitch together some excuse, some justification. But her confidence had cracks now, and once Karen had cracks. Her mask slipped fast. You don't understand," she tried again, softer. "This time, this entire community depends on order. Without me enforcing the rules, it would fall into chaos. I'm only protecting everyone's property values." The investigator raised a brow, unimpressed. "Property values don't excuse harassment, they don't excuse trespassing, and they certainly don't excuse fraud." He leaned forward slightly. "We know about the fines you've pocketed. We know about the contracts you've funneled to your relatives. And we know about the intimidation tactics you've used to silence your neighbors. My breath caught. Fraud, pocketed fines. I had. Suspected Karen was more than just power-hungry. But to hear it laid bare like that, was almost too much to process. Karen's face flushed crimson. And for a split second, the mask slipped completely. Her lips curled into a snarl, her voice breaking. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she hissed. "Yes," the man said flatly, not blinking. "And very soon, the entire state will know who you are." The silence that followed pressed down, like a storm about to break. Karen's chest rose and fell in quick bursts, her fists tightening at her sides. I thought she might lunge forward, scream, maybe even strike, but instead, she spun on her heel, stormed to the door, and spat out, "You'll regret this," before slamming it so hard the cabin rattled for a long moment. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. I stared at the investigator, trying to piece together everything I'd just heard. Finally, I found my voice. "You knew about her, even before tonight." He nodded, calm as ever. "We've had complaints from multiple residents, but no one was willing to come forward with enough evidence. They were scared. That's why your documentation was so important. You gave us the paper trail. Tonight, she gave us everything else." I let out a shaky laugh, more relief than humor. "So, what happens now?" He glanced at the door, then back at me, his eyes steady. "Now, we build the case. And when we're done, Mrs. Whitmore won't just lose her position. She may very well lose her freedom." I let out a shaky laugh, more relief than humor. "So, what happens now?" He glanced at the door, then back at me, his eyes steady. "Now we build the case. And when we're done, Mrs. Whitmore won't just lose her position. She may lose her freedom." For the first time in years, I felt my shoulders lighten. The invisible weight Karen had forced me to carry began to loosen just slightly, like shackles slipping off. But even in that moment of relief, I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. She was a wounded predator. Now, and that made her even more dangerous. I learned that the very next morning, the sun rose, gentle and gold, over the lake, mist curling across the water like smoke. I stepped outside to breathe it in, my chest filling with something that almost felt like hope. But as I walked down the gravel path toward the mailbox at the end of the drive, I saw it a bright red spray-painted word across the wooden cabin. Gate.thief. My stomach dropped. I glanced around, but the road was empty, the neighborhood still waking. The word burned on the wood, ugly and loud. I didn't need to guess who had done it. By noon, my phone rang non-stop. Anonymous numbers. Nasty voicemails. Residents parroting Karen's lies, accusing me of trying to ruin the community, of stealing from the HOA. She was spreading poison faster than I could defend myself, twisting the narrative like only she could. That evening, my sister called in tears. Someone had slipped a note under her door. "Tell your brother to back off," it read, or "the whole family pays." That was when I realized Karen wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting to destroy me, to destroy us. And if the Attorney General's office was going to bring her down, I had to survive the storm she was about to unleash. And deep down, despite the fear clawing at my ribs, I made a promise to myself. I would not run. Not this time. This was my father's cabin, my family's legacy. If Karen wanted a war, then a war she would get. The word thief still glared from my gate the next morning. And even though I had scrubbed at it until my hands blistered, the paint clung stubbornly, seared into the wood like a scar. I stood there, staring at it, chest tight, knowing that it wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. Karen wanted me humiliated. She wanted the neighborhood to drive past, whisper, and point. She wanted me broken before the real fight even began. By the time I returned inside, my phone buzzed with another unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked it up, enjoying the fame. The voice sneered. "Karen, she didn't even try to hide it. You think that badge-wielding friend of yours scares me? I've been running this place for years. People trust me. They'll believe me before they believe you. You're nothing but a squatter clinging to some old shack your father left you. And soon enough, you'll be out." Her laugh, sharp and cruel, echoed even after she hung up. I stared at the dead phone screen, fighting the urge to hurl it across the room. Rage surged hot through my veins, but beneath it was something colder resolve. Karen wasn't bluffing. She was gearing up for a full-scale war, and if I wasn't careful, she'd drag my family into it. That evening, the investigator returned. He saw the vandalized gate, the stack of nasty letters shoved under my door, the tire tracks across my lawn where someone had swerved deliberately just to tear it up. "She's escalating," he muttered, snapping photos for the record. "That's good and bad." "Good?" I asked, incredulous. He nodded. "The more desperate she becomes, the more mistakes she'll make. People like Karen always believe they're untouchable. That arrogance is what gets them caught. But you need to be ready. It's going to get worse before it gets better." And worse it did. 2 days later, my niece Emily begged me not to come to her school play. At first, I thought she was just nervous about being on stage. But when I pressed, she broke down crying. "A girl said her mom told her you're a criminal," she whispered, her little voice shaking. "She said, you'll go to jail and they'll take the cabin away. I don't want anyone laughing at me." Okay, my chest cracked open hearing that. This fight wasn't just staining my reputation anymore. It was bleeding into the people I loved most. Emily was just a child, yet Karen had poisoned even her safe spaces with lies. I held her close, promising her through my own tears that none of it was true, that her uncle wasn't going anywhere. But when she finally fell asleep against my shoulder, I stared at the ceiling and swore to myself that Karen would never get away with this. Not 1 inch more. The investigator encouraged me to stay calm, to let the process work. "The Attorney General's office moves carefully," he said. "We build a case step by step. Every witness, every victim, every document. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice." But deep inside, I wanted more than justice. I wanted her to feel what I had felt, the helplessness, the humiliation, the fear of losing everything. My father's voice echoed in my head, warning me about wrestling with pigs. But this wasn't about getting dirty anymore. This was about survival. Then came the town meeting. Karen called it herself a special emergency session, claiming it was to discuss community misconduct. I knew it was a stage for her performance, and part of me wanted to skip it. But the investigator urged me to attend. Stand your ground. Let her expose herself. The meeting hall was packed, the air thick with whispers. Neighbors I had shared cookouts and fishing trips with avoided my eyes, their faces tight with unease. Karen stood at the front, polished as always, her pearl necklace gleaming like armor. "Because," she tapped the microphone, her voice sweet as sugar, but sharp as glass. "Friends, we are facing a crisis in our beloved community," she began. "One of our so-called neighbors has been flagrantly disregarding our rules, threatening our harmony, and even conspiring with outsiders to dismantle the association that keeps us safe. This person has shown themselves to be a liar and, frankly, a thief." All eyes turned toward me. The shame burned, but I stayed seated, fists clenched beneath the table. Karen paced slowly, letting her words drip into the crowd like poison. "We have the right, no, the duty to protect our community from those who would destroy it. I am calling for a vote, effective immediately. We moved to fine, foreclose, and evict this individual for the good of us all." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded, some frowned. Some just sat frozen, waiting to see where the tide would go. That was when the investigator stood. He didn't shout, he didn't wave papers. He simply walked to the front, calm and steady, and placed a thick folder on the table beside Karen. "Before you vote," he said, his voice carrying with quiet authority, "I think it's only fair this community knows the whole truth." Karen stiffened, color draining from her face. The investigator flipped open the folder, pulling out copies of documents, contracts, and bank transfers. He began reading aloud. Funds from HOA dues mysteriously routed to Karen's brother's construction. Company, inflated fines collected in cash with no record. Community improvement budgets siphoned into administrative fees tied directly to her personal accounts. The room went still, the silence heavy with betrayal. Karen tried to cut in, her voice rising. "Lies. All lies. This man is an outsider. He doesn't know how we operate." But the investigator didn't falter. "These aren't my documents. They're yours, pulled from the very records you tried to keep hidden. You've used this community like your own personal piggy bank, Mrs. Whitmore, and you've bullied anyone who dared to question it." A gasp broke from somewhere in the crowd, then another, and another. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak began murmuring, louder this time. Anger building. For the first time, Karen looked small, cornered, exposed. But even then, she wasn't done fighting. Her eyes darted wildly until they landed on me, sitting near the back. Her voice cracked as she pointed a trembling finger. "This is your fault. You think you've won. I'll destroy you for this." The investigator turned toward her, his voice firm as a gavel. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. You destroyed yourself." And in that moment, I knew the tide had finally shifted. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time. The community saw her for what she truly was. The meeting didn't end with applause or cheers. It ended in a stunned, suffocating silence, the kind that clings to the skin like humidity before a storm. People filed out in slow, uneasy groups, their voices low but urgent, fragments of disbelief and betrayal hanging in the air. I stayed seated, my pulse still hammering in my ears, watching Karen cling to her pearls like they were a life raft. Her mask had cracked, her empire was wobbling, but I knew her well enough to recognize one thing: she wasn't finished. As I left the hall, an older neighbor, Mr. Callahan, shuffled up beside me. His voice was shaky, but his eyes held a flicker of guilt. "Son, I should have spoken up sooner," he said quietly. "She threatened me too. Said she'd have my house foreclosed if I didn't keep quiet about the fines." I didn't want to believe it, but I'm glad someone finally stood up to her. I managed a nod, though my throat was too tight to speak. That night, as I drove back to the cabin, headlights trailing across the dark road, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The truth was out now. People saw her for what she was. But a cornered animal fights hardest, and Karen wasn't going to vanish into the night without a final strike. And then, just like that, tit was over. The room exhaled all at once. Neighbors who had avoided me for months approached with hesitant smiles, murmuring apologies, offering hands I wasn't sure I could shake just yet. My body felt light and heavy at the same time, relief flooding in, exhaustion pressing down. But as I drove back to the cabin that night, the word payback still lingered in my mind. Karen was gone, but her shadow stretched long. She had vowed to drag me down with her. And something in her eyes told me she wasn't finished, not yet. And I couldn't help but wonder. What if she meant it? What if the real war had only just begun? The night after Karen's arrest was the first time in months I thought I might actually sleep. The cabin was quiet, the lake calm, and for a few brief hours, it felt like the nightmare might finally be over. I remember sitting by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, whispering to my dad's memory that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally kept the promise I made to protect what he built. But peace, I would learn, was only an illusion. The next morning, I woke to a sound that churned my stomach, the low growl of an engine outside. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, expecting maybe a neighbor. Instead, I saw a black SUV parked at the end of the driveway. Tinted windows, no plates. My blood ran cold. I stepped onto the porch, forcing my voice steady. "Can I help you?" The driver's side window rolled down just enough to reveal a man's face, hard, weathered, unfamiliar. His eyes locked on me, unblinking. Then, in a voice that carried across the gravel, he said, "Karen has friends. Powerful friends. She might be in cuffs, but don't think this is over. Drop it, or next time, it won't just be your cabin that gets torn apart." The SUV roared to life and sped away, gravel spitting under its tires, leaving only a trail of dust and a knot of dread in my gut. I called the investigator immediately. He came straight out, his jaw tight as I described what happened. "Intimidation. Tactics," he muttered, pacing the porch. "She must have people on the outside, contractors, cronies, maybe even folks she cut deals with. They're trying to scare you into backing off before trial." But isn't she locked up?" I asked, frustration spilling into my voice. He nodded. "She is, but jail bars don't erase leverage. People like Karen don't build power alone. They build webs. And sometimes those webs are dirtier than anyone realizes." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run down the road and chase that SUV until my legs gave out. But more than anything, I wanted to protect my family. Because if Karen still had strings to pull, then we weren't safe, not me, not my sister, not Emily. That evening, my sister called again, her voice trembling. "There were men outside my house," she whispered. "They didn't knock. They just stood there, staring, and then they left." My chest tightened until it hurt. I promised her I'd keep her safe, but deep down, fear gnawed at me. How far could Karen reach from behind bars? And how much was she willing to destroy just to keep her pride intact? The investigator arranged for extra patrols near my sister's place and mine, but even with the flashing reassurance of passing cruisers, the unease never left. I jumped at every sound, the snap of a branch outside, the groan of the cabin walls, even the gentle lap of water against the dock. It felt like living under siege. Then, 3 nights later, the fire happened. It was just past midnight when I woke to the acrid sting of smoke. At first, I thought it was the fireplace, but when I stumbled out of bed, my chest already tight, I saw the glow outside the window. My dock was burning. Flames licked upward, crackling and spitting. The wooden planks my father had hammered with his own hands consumed in a storm of orange. I ran outside, grabbing the old garden hose, spraying desperately at the edges, but it was no use. The fire had been set deliberately, accelerant poured in thick streaks. The investigator's words echoed in my head. "She has friends." By the time the fire department arrived, the dock was gone. Nothing but charred beams smoldering over the water. I stood there in the ash, coughing, my face streaked with soot and tears. That dock wasn't just wood, was memories. My dad teaching me to fish, Emily laughing as she dangled her toes. In the water, quiet nights when I sat alone with my thoughts. And now it was gone, stolen in the dark, like everything else Karen touched. The fire marshal pulled me aside, his tone grave. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to send a message. The investigator arrived soon after, his expression darker than I'd ever seen. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "This changes things," he said quietly. "We're no longer just dealing with fraud and harassment. We're dealing with arson, and that carries serious weight in court." But I barely heard him. All I could think about was my father's voice, my niece's tears, the charred ruin at the edge of the lake. Karen had already lost her title, her reputation, her freedom, but even from a cell. She had managed to take something irreplaceable from me, and something inside me hardened that night. I wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. I was fighting for revenge. I wanted her to feel the hollow ache of loss, the fire that keeps burning long after the flames are out. And though I didn't yet know how, I swore to myself I would find a way. The trial was coming. Karen would face her reckoning in front of the entire state. And when she did, I would be there not just as a witness, but as the voice of every person she had tried to break. But before that day came, Karen had one final move. And it would test just how much I was willing to sacrifice to see her fall. The night after the raid on Karen's little empire, I sat by the lake in my cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, watching the rippling water reflect the moonlight, like silver veins across black glass. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like justice. But revenge has a strange way of hollowing you out before it fills you back up. All I could hear was my father's voice echoing in my head, telling me years ago, "Son, this lake will test you, not with storms, but with people." And he was right. The storm hadn't been the wind or rain. It had been a woman who thought power came from fear. Karen's name was splashed all over the papers the next morning. A president arrested in racketeering and fraud case. The details spilled out like poison seeping from a cracked bottle. Extortion schemes, embezzlement of HOA funds, harassment cases, even ties to contractors she bribed for kickbacks. It was ugly. The kind of story that made ordinary people sit at their breakfast tables and shake their heads in disbelief. But for those of us who had lived under her rule, it wasn't disbelief, it was relief. At last, the monster had a face everyone could see. The Attorney General's office wasted no time. Investigators combed through HOA records, exposing years of Karen's corruption. Her cronies fell like dominoes. Some turned on her instantly, cutting deals to save themselves. Others tried to play dumb, but the evidence was too deep. The HOA board dissolved under state order. The lake community that had once been strangled by her demands now stood leaderless, free, but shaken. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started showing up at my cabin. Some with pies, others with trembling hands clutching old bills Karen had shoved under their doors. They cried when they told their stories of losing savings, of children scared by HOA harassment, of marriages that nearly broke under the stress of fines and threats. I listened to every one of them. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about healing. About making sure what happened here could never happen again. The Attorney General, still half amused at how this had unfolded, asked me to help organize the cleanup. Not in any official government capacity, but as someone the community trusted. At first, I resisted. I didn't want to be the guy everyone looked to. I was just the man in the cabin, the one who wanted peace. But then I saw the way Mrs. Langley, the elderly woman Karen had tried to evict, looked at me, as if I was the only anchor she had left in a storm that had swallowed her whole. And I realized maybe this was the role I had been preparing. For my whole life, without knowing it, Karen's trial dragged on for months. She tried every trick in the book: expensive lawyers, fake medical conditions, sob stories about how she only wanted the neighborhood to thrive. But each time she opened her mouth, another witness came forward. Her lies crumbled like sandcastles against the tide. The day the jury found her guilty on every count, I wasn't even in the courtroom. I was on the dock with my kids, teaching them how to cast fishing lines, letting the world move on without me. When I heard the verdict, I didn't cheer. I just closed my eyes and whispered, "It's over." The HOA's millions, the ones she had siphoned away, were redirected back into the community. Roads were repaired. The lake was cleaned. Up families who had been unfairly fined were reimbursed. And the best part? The HOA itself was dissolved entirely. No more Karen, no more board. Just neighbors living beside each other, free to breathe again. But there was one last piece of closure I didn't expect. Weeks after her sentencing, I received a letter, handwritten, from Karen herself. It was bitter, angry, filled with venom. She blamed me for everything. Said I had ruined her life, destroyed her future, painted her as a villain when she was just a woman trying to lead. I burned the letter in my fireplace without reading the rest. Some battles don't deserve answers. Some enemies aren't worth words. That night, as the ashes drifted up the chimney, my wife slipped her hand into mine. "You did it," she whispered, but I shook my head. "No," I said softly, looking at my children sleeping on the rug by the fire. "We all did, together." Because that was the truth. I hadn't brought Karen down alone. It had been every neighbor who stood up, every person who refused to be silent, every family who clung to hope that justice would come. And as the wind rustled through the pines and the lake shimmered under the stars, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not fear, not anger. But Peace Karen thought she owned this community. She thought she could control us with fines, threats, and fear. But what she never understood, what she never could understand, was that this lake didn't belong to her. It didn't even belong to me. It belonged to all of us. And as long as we stood together, no one could ever take it away again. So when people now ask me about the day Karen busted into my cabin and found the Attorney General inside, I just smile. Because in that single moment, her empire began to collapse. She thought she was kicking down a door to power. But really, she was walking straight into her own downfall. And for the first time in a long time, the lake was quiet again.